Okay, why don't we start? I'm Ken Bamberger, the Rosalinde and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Law at UC Berkeley and the co-faculty director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. This has been a difficult and heartbreaking week for all of us here at the Helen Diller Institute, for so many members of our Berkeley community, and for so many people on this call. I want to start just by saying a few words about the Helen Diller Institute's pivot to programming and how we are addressing our Berkeley students' critical needs for learning and community these days. Our staff and faculty are working intensely on new ways to offer deep support for our students and creating spaces for students and faculty to come together. Our visiting Israeli faculty in Berkeley, 6 faculty members from Israel spending the year here, and our own faculty are meeting daily with students in person and on Zoom, sharing insights and experience and space for talking about traumas every single day. Our former visitors back in Israel are meeting daily with our students in our public programming. Today we have Times of Israel senior analyst Haviv Rettig Gur for an emergency briefing. Next week, the writer and psychologist Ayelet Gunder-Goshen will speak about her role as an emergency worker, offering counseling to the victims of the Hamas massacre today. We're going to pivot our October 30th talk, which was to be in person, with New York Times correspondent Isabel Kirshner. We're pivoting that to a virtual format. Isabel can't leave Israel at this moment for understandable reasons, but will share her insights with our campus. I also want to say at the Helen Diller Institute that we are so grateful to so many of you on this call for enabling us to do this work. We are entirely supported by our community, and I want to thank you for your ongoing support for us. I note that this is being recorded, that recordings are being made available on our website after events have concluded, and we'll put the website into the chat. Okay, to today, we are here again with our good friend Haviv Rettig Gur, who already was doing a series of briefings on the ground of what's going on in Israel. And today, although he's in great demand, is coming to us for an emergency briefing. Haviv is a veteran Israeli journalist who serves as the senior analyst for the Times of Israel. He's covered Israeli politics, foreign policy, the education system, and the relationship with the Jewish diaspora since 2005. He's reported from over 20 countries. He served as director of communications for Israel's largest NGO, the Jewish Agency. Welcome, Haviv.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, let me start by asking you personally, how are you doing? Maybe you can share some of that if it's not too big a boundary crossing.
My situation is probably a roughly average for Israelis right now. We have good friends, a colleague of my wife's. My wife works in a small NGO, about 12 employees. One of the employees has lost 11 members of her family on October 7th. 3 of them have been found dead. We buried her father today. I was at a funeral about 3 hours ago. And 8 are still missing and probably in Gaza, probably taken hostages. They include her 4-year-old niece, Yaheli. They include her 8-year-old nephew, and through an aunt, a 12-year-old cousin. So those are the kids. There's also her mother. Many people missing in that family, and the family is shattered. The funeral is a funeral for a 66-year-old grandpa, but actually it was not like any funeral I've ever been at, because although I've been at a few these last 10 or 12 days, because over it hangs this horror of these missing kids, and so it was it was unlike any experience I've ever had. I think there isn't a family in Israel. I have a brother-in-law in the paratroopers called up now. His wife is 8 months pregnant. She can't be home alone. She's living with us. And another brother who's in the Armored Corps and also called up. Again, very common for Israeli families right now. And we're watching Gaza unfold. We're watching the suffering in Gaza. We know there is suffering in Gaza. We know something that, to the frustration of people like me who are attuned to the international conversation, most Israelis really, I don't think are. I think, well, as everyone at this institute will know, Israelis speak Hebrew amongst themselves, which is a very small language, not spoken widely, and are very provincial, and don't really notice what the international press says about them. But it's been a frustrating week to deal with. I want to say something impolite with apologies to everyone here. It's been a frustrating week to deal with non-Israelis. The trauma is so deep. 1,500 or more than 1,400 dead. This is the greatest disaster. This is every Jew knows the word Kishinev, not because they remember their Moldovan geography, but because that was a defining moment of suffering in the 20th century that almost opened the 20th century Jewish experience. Hamas on October 7th gave us 25 Kishinevs in terms of death toll, and tortured people. My best friend, a guy I drink beers with very regularly, whose son and my son are in the same class, is the head of a CSI unit, a crime scene investigation unit in the police, that was tasked with doing the initial crime scene workup for all the bodies. And so he stood for 5 days in the body collection complex to which they'd brought hundreds and hundreds of bodies that they're still finding a few. Today they found a little boy who had crawled, hiding from the gunman, had crawled into an attic, and the house burned down, and he was killed by the burns. So he stood for 5 days going, opening body bags, never knowing what he's going to find. And he tells me most bodies had more than one cause of death, meaning you open the body and the body had stabbing and also burning and also shooting wounds. And so this was an event that is still, the world has moved on because the world's very busy. Israelis are not moving on, and they're not going to move on for a long time. It's going to shape Gaza. It's going to shape the Gaza war. It means that Israelis are giving this government essentially infinite capital. You can think that's a good thing or a terrible thing. You can be terrified for Gazans. But it is simply a truth. It is simply a diagnostic truth that Israelis give this government and the army infinite capital to get rid of Hamas once and for all. And Hamas, of course, is forcing us. I'm sorry to sound propagandistic. I can't express how deeply this is the very blunt, simple emotion that all Israelis agree on right now into the deep, deep left. Hamas is forcing us to go through Gaza's civilian population to get to it. But we will. And So this is going to get much worse before it gets better, and it's going to last a long time. And it's all very, very personal. So that's how I'm doing.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about Israel's response to the massacre on the ground, and to the abduction of Israeli hostages and those of other nationalities. And by Israel's response, I mean the state and also society, civilians.
It's been astonishing. It's been unspeakably beautiful. I don't know if it's easy to imagine outside of Israel. My brother-in-law's pregnant wife couldn't be alone. We want her with us. We don't have enough bedrooms. And she would share a bathroom with my 4 little kids, 3 of whom are boys. And that's, don't ever share a bathroom with 3 little boys. And so our neighbor has an upstairs bedroom and bathroom that a kid lives in, and that kid moved in with another sibling, and the neighbor just gave her her own little suite. We didn't even manage to ask. It happened so quickly. Everybody is cooking for everybody in the neighborhood. Everybody's taking care of everybody constantly. My 12-year-old son has a dog walking business. And he's now walking dogs for free if you're for everyone in the reserves. And so all the dogs in the street are getting walked by these kids who just, that's what they're doing. Because if you got called up to the army, you don't have to pay for the dog to get walked. It's how we take care of you. So there's just, I'm giving examples that sound anecdotal. It's overwhelming. It's everything, everywhere. When somebody in our neighborhood breaks down, there's a little, there are a few psychologists living on my street, 3 or 4 Israeli neighborhoods essentially organized by WhatsApp groups. There's a neighborhood WhatsApp, and it has really built a neighborhood, this one little technology. And there's group of 3 or 4 psychologists. If anybody needs any kind of help, they go to one of them who was designated the organizer, and there's one of them will come to sit with you for an hour. The entire street, the entire, I don't know what that is, 70 families, something like that. So that is happening all over Israel. The army called up 250,000 troops, the biggest call up in its history, apparently. And at least 50,000 more showed up that it didn't call up. People are volunteering in record numbers for ambulance services, and medics courses. Went to donate blood. I have AB negative blood, which means that I really can't receive anybody's blood out there, but my plasma is a universal donor plasma. And I went to donate because it's very useful and special, and they need a lot of plasma, and there are very few people with AB negative blood, and the line was out the door. I mean, you had to stand 3 hours just to donate. So Israel, on the society, ordinary people, there is a sense of siege, there is a sense of war, there is a sense of togetherness, there is a sense of the horrors, there's just the horrors of that massacre have created a sense of shared fate that, we read about in our history books back when we had existential wars. Well, this feels existential. I think we didn't just wake up to the horror of it. It wasn't just the pogroms, the scale of that pogrom and the memory echoing from our history books and from some kind of memory of the pogrom. We believed that Hamas was deterred, and we believed that that border was basically safe. And we can have, endless debates about what to do in Gaza and about the morality of the blockade. Goodness knows we had them. I had strong opinions about them. But at the end of the day, what we woke up to discover was that Hamas was not deterred, ever. And any quiet we might have bought on that border, we essentially bought on credit. And when the bill came due, it was too painful to bear. And If you wake up with that lesson on the Gaza border, Lebanon suddenly looks very different. And the many militias in Syria that answer only to Iran, they don't answer to the Syrian government, suddenly look very different. And the Houthis in Yemen talking about rocketing Eilat suddenly sound very different. And the Shia militias controlled by Iran in Iraq, we are suddenly noticing that the Iranian strategy of destroying us with the death of 1,000 cuts is very advanced, and we have been very relaxed about it. Very, I don't remember what the word is, but very, dismissive maybe of it. So the Israel that awoke after October 7th is an Israel that is suddenly believes itself, sees the enemy bristling around it on almost all its borders. That has created a tremendous solidarity that is reflected in how people speak on the street. Our politics are suddenly not poisonous. Things are coming together in ways that I have never felt. I've never experienced this.
It's particularly striking. You and I were supposed to have a conversation, a webinar in another week or two, talking about the progress in the judicial reform and what the right-wing government was going to propose, and the legislation that was supposed to be submitted and taken up 2 days ago to exempt Haredim from military service. It was the most divisive time in Israeli society, Israeli history, at least recent history. And now, even in the first few days when the government was moving like a large tanker ship and hard to turn around and figure out even what was going on, the brothers and sisters in arms group who had run the protests set up their headquarters in Tel Aviv and on rest stops on the roads all going south, where they coordinated everything that needed to be done. Maybe say a little bit about this protest movement, state, various parts of Israeli society, and that divide that was 10 days ago on the tip of all of our tongues.
Yeah, I think we discovered that we learned a lot in the last 10 days. How many times have I used the word discovered? I think we discovered that there were agents of division within us. It's not us. Democratic politics worldwide are because of all these things that are very well studied and that we're really starting to understand quite well: social media, echo chambers, and algorithms, and the simple fact that partisanship and polarization are very useful political vehicles makes them used. And so you had these incredibly manipulative campaigns. Political campaigning has become very scientific, very psychologically, well understood, and very manipulative. And we have been engaging in, American politics are undergoing a tremendous and profound polarization, measurable. But Americans actually disagree on really major things. Israel is undergoing massive and profound polarization up until October 7th, basically. But 80% of Israelis agree on just about every issue. And so the polarization is not a function of the substance of our debates. It's a function of political usefulness of polarization, manipulation of polarization, how political campaigns work, how effective marketing, the scientificization of marketing has become. And also, of course, social media algorithms. And by the way, it began with television, not with social media, this sort of sorting of people into these narrow ideological echo chambers. So all of that, true. Let's set that aside. Almost to an issue, almost to a claim, this government's claim about the protest movement, about the opposition, about the opposition to the judicial reform have been shown to be false. One of the favorite lines of the opposition movement, of this government, was to go after Meretz member of Knesset and former Army Deputy Chief of Staff, Yair Golan, who was a very, he's a general, former general, but also a very progressive and left-wing voice in Israeli politics. And while the government and the ministers wouldn't, this massacre was slow. It took 10 hours, and the army's battalions didn't show up. And the shocking, incompetence we discovered the moment Hamas actually was brazen enough to actually cross the border. There was this frozenness, motionlessness, until about 10 hours in, battalions are finally starting to arrive in the area. Over those 10 hours, Israelis are literally reading on their social media, in Hebrew social media or in WhatsApp groups, help, from someone they know, or from someone who's 1 or 2 degrees away from them. Help, I'm in my bomb shelter of my home, I'm locked in, there are gunmen outside, if they get to me, we're going to die. And then 4 hours later, why is nobody coming? This is something that Israelis just literally went through for hours and hours and experienced that helplessness. But not Yair Golan. Yair Golan is in his mid-60s now. He got in a car. He has, I think, a handgun. I don't know what he has. And he just drove. And he drove in there, and he drove through the desert to this music festival. And he picked up a kid fleeing in the desert from the gunmen, and he drove out, and then he drove back in and drove out and drove back in. Another former Major General, Noam Tibon, was... his son, Amir Tibon, a friend of mine, a wonderful journalist at Haaretz, lived in Kibbutz he's alive, and lives in Kibbutz Be'eri, which was besieged by these gunmen, and they went through and essentially, I think that massacred the population of Kibbutz Be'eri. He and his 2 girls are hiding in their home bomb shelter, and their father, their grandpa, Amir Noam Tibon, who, by the way, was my brigade commander when I was in the infantry as a much younger man, just drove in there and engaged the terrorists in a gun battle, and then knocked on the door of the bomb shelter room and popped his head up to this, window of the door and said, "It's Grandpa," and took the family out and drove out of that town. And so we discovered that the heroes of that moment, the massacres, there was a huge battle in Sderot at the police station. A lot of people dead in many places, but the hardest hit places were the left-wing kibbutzim. And the left-wing kibbutzim were centerpieces, or that left, that Israeli left, was the centerpiece, the elite that right-wing propaganda has been telling us was a danger to the country and was anti-democratic for a very long time. You mentioned the Brothers in Arms movement. The Brothers in Arms movement is the part of the protest movement that said that if this country is no longer a democracy, we're no longer serving. And they had these long lists of petitions of soldiers, elite soldiers, commandos, and pilots, but also infantry from the regular battalions, who were simply quitting their reserve duty because the country would no longer be a democracy if the judicial reform passed. That was their argument. And they were called deserters by the right and by the government. And they were,
and traitors.
Traitors, and they were just horrible things were said about them. 3 hours into the attack, which begins at 6:30 in the morning, and nobody really understands what's happening. I saw the first news at maybe 8. It's a Saturday, it's a holiday, nobody's looking at their phones. I saw the first news at 8, and I thought, well, that's startling. Hamas crossed the border. My goodness, that must be an uncomfortable gun battle for 20 minutes. Reports of dead. Well, that's shocking. 20 dead. Well, that's astonishing. How could that possibly be? Some general's going to be fired for this, right? That was the kind of slow-moving news coming out. Nobody really understood what was going on. At 9:30 a.m., Brothers in Arms put out a statement. Benjamin Netanyahu has yet to speak to the nation. Nobody in the country knows anything except these rumors that are flying everywhere. At 9:30 a.m., they put out a statement that they are calling on all reservists to go to reserve duty. This is big. This is important. They're starting to set up, exactly what you mentioned. They're starting to set up institutions, really, both WhatsApp groups, but also kind of war rooms to help people get to their reserve units. There's no public transportation in Israel on the Sabbath, and to help families fleeing the massacre. And they have since built this immense warehouse that's been distributing aid and help. People call from all over the country and say what they need. Their families from Berkeley that have all been housed in a hotel for the last week or so. And, they run out of things. They're kids with nothing to do. So they send both people to play with them and also board games. They've become what the government hasn't been, which is actually organizing society around this tragedy. And call-up is at 120, 130%. So everything that all the rhetoric of the judicial reform from the right turned out to be lies, but visible lies, and lies in ways that cut to the quick. In other words, that Israelis are talking about. We saw on Channel 14, which is this very pro-Netanyahu, very populist channel, often engaging in very angry politics, pundits who are, deeply pro-Netanyahu suddenly say, stop lying to us, Netanyahu. Stop, just talk to us. Just be the leader we need you to be in this moment. It's not a game anymore. So yeah, I hesitate to say this. I think lessons are learned. In other words, I think that kind of divisive politics is going to be much harder to engage in the immediate aftermath of this. How long will that last? My generation doesn't remember the 73 war. It's not going to last forever. But I think that there has been a shift, at least for this generation. I don't think that kind of politics is going to work going forward for some time.
On that note, let me ask, politically, one of the key things that happened, although it took about 3 or 4 days longer than I think most people expected, was the creation of a unity cabinet and kind of a unity government to govern during this wartime period. How does that fit into the story?
Netanyahu went into this. Netanyahu's been polling very badly, essentially, since the judicial reform began. I don't think there's been one poll in 10 months that he didn't lose. I genuinely think there hasn't been a single one. He's 5 seats under, 10 seats under in every poll, right-wing polls, left-wing polls. And so he suddenly finds himself in this war with an immense trust deficit. And he handled it very poorly in the first few days, suggesting the trust deficit might not be crazy. For example, a lot of people started talking about a unity government, how the unity government's important. This is a real emergency. We go into Gaza, who knows what happens in Lebanon? Lebanon starts, that could be the Iran war. And so let's have a unity government. Also, a unity government would kick out of the decision-making circle, populists, real, silly, and also bad people, like Itamar Ben-Gvir. I apologize. I'm, of course, an objective journalist, but I allow myself on Ben-Gvir, and allow a much more competent and serious and thoughtful and apolitical decision-making body to actually handle the war. And for 3 days, nothing moved. And on day 4, Likud ministers leaked to the press SMSs they were getting from Netanyahu's wife, Sarah Netanyahu, that if they join in a unity government now with some opposition parties, then they'll be dependent on them after the war, and they'll topple them, and there'll be an election, and they'll lose the election. So it's the post-war politics will be bad for us if we have a unity government now. And the Likud ministers are so horrified that they gave that to the press. And then Likud's official spokespeople issued a statement. She was forced to issue a statement in support of unity, and Likud's official spokespeople put it out on Likud's official, channels. And so, we all the political journalists like me all got this message: Likud, Prime Minister's wife, it's time for unity. And that was worse, because we just watched the most horrifying massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Who gives a shit? Why is the political party currently in power telling us about the Prime Minister's wife? Why is she in the room? Why is she relevant? And so there was this this, by the way, is a question that was asked in Likud by Likud people. And we have a poll from yesterday. Likud is down from the 64 seats it has. It polled between 56 and maybe 54. It's down to 40 seats now, the entirety of this coalition. And so the politics was handled very, very poorly. This unity government Netanyahu needed it because of that trust deficit. His first few days that he mishandled the response and really mishandled the political situation forced him into it. It's a very narrow war cabinet of 5 people, 3 of whom are generals. And that's it. That's all I have to say about that. And nobody's thought of it since. Everyone's very satisfied that the Ben-Gvirs are out of the decision-making process, the Smotriches are out of the decision-making process, and some very competent, calm, thoughtful people are running this war.
There are a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A about the kind of international dimensions of it. An extraordinary day today in that President Biden came to Israel, and I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. But I want to ask first a kind of question that seems to be a number of folks are interested in, which is I think their reading of your statement that Israelis are kind of unified around the idea that Hamas needs to be gotten rid of, and that has to be the ultimate goal, asking whether that means Israelis are not concerned. I didn't hear you say this exactly, but a number of folks were asking with the international coverage and the relation to that coverage and the world's opinion, which goes to the second event of the last 24 hours, which was the coverage in the United States and around the world about the explosion around the hospital in Gaza, and how over 7 hours, what was reported initially turned out to be demonstrably false. So I'll ask you kind of the bigger question of Israelis caring about how Israel is viewed, and the kind of catch-22 of the way people are framing that.
One of the most important things to know about us, one of the deepest sort of ethosi, that define us as a culture, is not caring what other people think. The diaspora condition of a Jew, that sounded like the beginning of a late 19th century Zionist pamphlet. The diaspora condition of a Jew is the minority condition, in which you are constantly aware of what people think of you. In a place like America, where Jews have been accepted profoundly as Americans, it's a little less so, maybe a lot less so. But in countries like Russia, or in places in most of the rest of the world, outside the English-speaking world, by the way, it's why most of the Jewish diaspora is English-speaking today, almost in its entirety. In most places in the world, Jews are always aware of themselves as a minority and always aware of what everyone thinks about them. And part of, from 1881, Auto-Emancipation by Leo Pinsker, one of the essential lessons of the Zionist movement that it inculcated and taught in schools and wrote its history of the Jews according to this ethos. The ethos is you don't justify yourself. You don't explain yourself. You don't ask for permission to exist, because the non-Jew wants you to ask for permission to exist and for you to live there. Now, when you're living under Imperial Russia, that is absolutely correct. That was the experience. People who talk about whether Israel has a right to exist, to Israelis, that makes a lot of sense, because what Zionism taught us was that the non-Jew thinks he has the right to decide whether I have the right to exist, and I should say to him, go fuck yourself. Excuse me, I apologize. I don't actually apologize, but I won't do that again. But the point is, that is a deep Zionist impulse. And it's one reason why the state of Israel keeps establishing public diplomacy ministries and then keeps closing them down. I think that ministry has been established 5 times and nobody knows what to do with it. Israelis are terrible at telling their story. And they're terrible at telling their story because it feels like justification. And to be Israeli is to not justify yourself to the world. And so there's a deep, every time the world comes around and says the international community, the UN, public opinion, anywhere on earth, including the United States, who Israelis do care about, turns against Israel, the automatic Israeli answer is, well, I am not going to justify my existence. If they don't understand, they don't understand, and that's their problem. What's important isn't what they think, it's what I do. This is a deep, deep impulse of Israeli culture. So that's point 1. Point 2, international opinion is the hospital. What the heck happened in the hospital? Islamic Jihad fired a rocket. It fell short. It blew up in a parking lot of a hospital. It should have killed 1 person, 2 people. It was a small explosion. It was a packed parking lot, but kinetically, it wouldn't have done much damage. But because it fell short and almost didn't get to launch properly, it was full of fuel. And so the entire parking lot essentially rained fire. And lots of people were killed in that parking lot from that fire. And Hamas put out a statement that there are 500 dead from an Israeli airstrike, and every single news outlet on earth ran with it. It was the top story of the New York Times for hours. And the only thing they knew, the only source they had was Hamas just throwing it out there. The Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, which is literally entirely appointed and controlled by Hamas. And so they failed. The international community ran with, there's a synagogue burned down in Tunisia by a mob now. Because of that, the entire Arab world is convinced it happened. Al Jazeera won't correct the story, won't even question the story. And all of it is based on a tiny little single sentence statement by Hamas that nobody decided to question, and nobody goes from the most, propagandistic government journalistic outlet in some Arab dictatorship all the way to the New York Times. Literally nobody questioned it. It took the New York Times a long time to add the words Palestinians say to the headline. It took them even longer to change it from a strike to an explosion. And at this moment, the BBC is still saying, we already know, the National Security Council and the Pentagon have come out and said we've examined it independently from 6 different angles. It definitely was a rocket. We have footage of the rocket. And right now, the BBC still says it's inconclusive. And so there's this backpedaling. The Israeli feeling about this war is simple. I think the Israeli popular feeling, I don't even think government spokespeople. The Israeli popular feeling about this war is simple. If 1,400 Jews are massacred by gleeful, laughing gunmen who broadcast all of their crimes on social media to the Israeli people and to the world, and the crimes are horrific. It's a crime against humanity what happened there. It's not a simple massacre, so to speak. I don't know what a simple massacre is, but it wasn't enough to kill. They were tortured, and children were tortured. The multiple wounds are on children's bodies as often as on adults. If that doesn't result, if that sign of weakness in the Middle East, in which major powers are out to destroy us, doesn't result in an upending of our geopolitical situation, our regional situation, then the state of Israel has failed its one mission, which is to keep us safe, to protect us. State of Israel's founding in 1948 was the moment Jews stopped dying. It was the moment the DP camps finally emptied. all of those Holocaust survivors rescued by the Allies and then stuck behind barbed wire for 3 more years after what American high school students learn is their rescue. They finally leave when the State of Israel is founded, and that promise was broken. And so we have to get Hamas. Hamas made itself an intolerable threat. And that's their first crime. And then their second crime, this is, by the way, most fundamental principle of international law. Their second crime against humanity is hiding behind Gaza's civilian population and forcing us to go through Gaza's civilian population to get to them. But to Israelis now, after that massacre, that's not an argument for leaving them in existence. That's a powerful affirmation of the need to destroy them. And so there won't be stopping this Israeli juggernaut that's coming. And Gazans will suffer terribly. There's at least one hospital that reported running out of electricity in Gaza. There's fuel and generators in Hamas's bunkers for several months. And so Israelis don't feel like, I think I'm reflecting almost universal, including on the progressive left, almost universal public opinion. There isn't any Israeli patience for these questions right now. Hamas must be destroyed. And the fact that Hamas is making us cut through the Palestinian population to destroy it is Hamas's second crime against humanity in this whole story. And that is international law. I know that's throwing out that is international law to a group of academics is an invitation for symposia, but it is. It's what Israelis feel.
Let me reflect a number of the questions that others have sent. Both Hamas's attacks, both the massacre by Hamas and the subsequent rockets have killed not just Israeli Jews, but Arab citizens of Israel. And the son of Mohammed Darwash from the Hartman Institute, our partner in so many programs, driving an ambulance down to the nature concert, the peace concert, to try to save the people who were attacked. He himself was murdered and the ambulance stolen and taken to Gaza. Just one story out of many. What are you seeing on the ground in terms of Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs and their relationship as Israelis in their response to this situation?
Yeah, it's been astonishing. Mohammed and I were actually we had a big session on the nature of Israeli democracy, and there isn't. Hamas last Friday announced a day of rage that sparked protests in Sydney, Australia, where a few hundred people shouted, "Gas the Jews," for some reason, not clear why that's connected, but nevertheless, they shouted, "Gas the Jews," and it caused violence in Berlin, and it caused protests in New York and all of that. And it led to, there was, I hesitate to say none, but I know of no phenomenon of any Arab Israelis participating in any day of rage activities in Israel of any kind. What we have seen is probably the single most popular influencer, online influencer. That's a thing where young people get online and everybody wants to know what they think because they're fun to listen to. I don't understand this phenomenon, but I've been told it's a phenomenon. Nas is his stage name. He's actually got some wonderful videos, and he put out a political statement, which he never does. He never does politics. He put out a statement. He said, "I have always been both Palestinian and Israeli." And after what Hamas has done, and just the sense, that the Hamas is driving the Palestinian cause, Palestinian politics, the Palestinian polity into this dead end. And I read his statement. It's actually quite extraordinary, and it's very much his, and don't trust my poorly remembered paraphrase, but he ends it by saying, I used to be Palestinian Israeli, Palestinian first. I'm many things, but Palestinian was first. And now I'm Israeli Palestinian. I'm Israeli first. And that sentiment, we saw the anchor Lucia Harish put out a statement in English defending Israel and hating Hamas. Hamas managed to convince huge numbers of Israeli Arabs that it really was what ISIS was. It really was a kind of Daesh, a kind of this thing that they'd watched across the Syrian border in horror, and gratitude that they're not in that part of the Middle East that has such phenomena. And Hamas made itself look like that because of the atrocities in the massacre. And so there was this tremendous, the pro-Hamas parts of Israeli Arab politics, which is a minority, but a significant minority, as we saw in 2021, in May of 2021, went silent, and the participatory integrationist impulses just came out in incredibly, powerfully. There was a bicycle store owner, I think in a town called Tira, who gave 40 bicycles to the families that survived the massacre. His store was then burned down, apparently by one of the Arab crime organizations, which there's an overlap always between crime organizations and terror organizations everywhere, including among Israeli Arabs. And then donations started flowing in for him to rebuild it. And so there was this whole new discourse, the Golan Druze community, not quite Israeli Arabs, not quite Muslim, but Arabic speaking, complicated, most Druze are loyal to Israel, serve in the army. They are still loyal to Assad because the Golan is disputed, etc. People here understand, or maybe if you don't, it's not important. But what's important is that for the first time, they organized in their hundreds and came down off the plateau and came to a Jewish city, Kiryat Shmona, and volunteered and wanted to make a statement. Israelis were with you. And so there was this coming together. I described it coming together in my Jewish neighborhood, but there's a coming together that's pan-Israeli in a way that's astonishing, that was beautiful to see. I don't know if it's permanent. Hamas caused so much psychic damage, including in the Arab community, that I suspect it will be pretty resilient. The Ra'am political party has been consistent in saying that massacre was horrifying, and also calling on Israel to stop the attack in Gaza. It's not a party that thinks that, they're not Zionists, but they are integrationists. And that massacre was, for them, a moment where they made very clear that is, a crime against humanity and horrifying and anti-Islamic and all that. So I think it's all good news in that regard.
So Biden makes an extraordinary speech and then gets on a plane and comes to Israel today, spends the day in a war zone as missiles are falling, as rockets are being shot, where the German prime minister the day before had to run during a rocket siren while he was in the airport. What do we make of Biden's response? What's the meaning of it? And how might it be shaping Israeli behavior and maybe the outcome or the next steps at least?
I think there's layers to this. First of all, Joe Biden really does understand Israelis in a way that, I have been on, forgive me, college campuses. I have been on, on panels with supposed Israel experts, and I've heard things about Israelis that that have no connection to my experience of my people. But I think Biden understands Israeli psychology. He understands, for example, that what Hamas demonstrated for Israelis in the Israeli interpretation, in the Israeli mind, looks to Israelis like the costs of withdrawal. And that will, of course, make a two-state solution more difficult. And so Biden perceives Hamas, first of all, I think he genuinely personally loves Israel, connects with Israel, feels emotional affinity to Israel. Also, I
just want to clarify what you just said so that I understand. When Hamas is raising the cost of a two-state solution by signaling or making a reality that when Israelis withdraw, this is what you get. You get an enemy committed to your annihilation on your border. That's what you meant by the costs of withdrawal?
Yes, the Israeli experience is that at the height of the peace process in the 90s, in the fall of 2000, when all the soldiers had pulled out of Palestinian population centers and the final, borders of a Palestinian state were being negotiated at Camp David, and there was talk of shared sovereignty on the Temple Mount, and Bill Clinton said peace is imminent, and all of that, that's when 140 suicide bombings begin to blow up in Israeli cities by Fatah and also Hamas, and there's a big debate between Israelis and Palestinians over why it started and how it started, and we don't need to get into that, but just in the Israeli Jewish mainstream experience, this massive, brutal, mass murdering terrorism was the result of the withdrawals of the peace process, and also is something that happens when we don't withdraw. In other words, when you have a very right-wing government, it happens. In 1999, the Ehud Barak Labor government won that election talking about that peace. In other words, peace won that election. And so the Israelis get this massive mass murdering terrorist response from Palestinian politics, both when they're left-wing withdrawing and when they're right-wing, not with even very right-wing like this government. To Israelis, this is a Hamas signaling, anywhere you pull out of, we will murder your children from. And I think Joe Biden understands that that is what Israelis see. And so for him, Hamas is not just the enemy of decent civilization. I think for him, Hamas is also the enemy of any hope there can ever be for a two-state solution. I happen to agree with him in that view. I'm Israeli. Most Israelis agree with him in that view, but I do think he actually has a deep emotional view that puts Hamas on the other side of all that is good and wants Israel to be decisive and supports Israelis, and really was traumatized by that massacre. So I think there's an authentic emotional response there from the president. And we heard that in the first day or two. And then we waited 10 more days. And then the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, came to Israel, and he met for a long time with the war cabinet. Those are those 5 people, including Netanyahu, including Benny Gantz. And then he came out of that and announced that the president would come in a solidarity visit. That's very strange to me. I don't understand what this visit was about. If this visit was about solidarity, you can do that in Washington. The president of the United States is a busy man. He's having a crisis in Congress with the budget. He has 1,000 things to think about. He doesn't get on a plane to Israel overnight without planning, without announcing, on a solidarity visit that he didn't need to do for 10 long days. I think that those 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the Eastern Mediterranean also tell me that, because those are completely useless military systems in Gaza. They're not going to help us in Gaza. And it's not at all clear to me what they're going to do in Lebanon. I think that the Israeli leadership took the lesson that Hamas has just taught us, that you buy quiet on credit and the bill comes due, and and throughout all the plans for 15 years, Israeli strategic planning has been, we can deter. We have such devastating firepower. Nobody actually wants to escalate. And so it's a lot of this tit for tat silliness that these people need to stay in business, for their own propaganda purposes. Ultimately, they're all deterred. And Hamas has shown us that it is not deterred, and that Gaza's suffering has no relevance to its strategic calculations, and that it genuinely believes in the messianic sort of Islamic renewal theology that it talks about all the time. And it will go to that massively self-destructive war, and at horrible cost to us if we don't understand that. And so Hezbollah is no longer tenable as an enemy on our border. And all those militias in Syria and in Iraq and in Yemen are no longer tenable. And Israel must arise from that massacre. One of Israel's problems strategically in the region isn't just the scale of the massacre, it's who did it. This pathetic, weak organization that the Israeli army could destroy in, a couple hours of bombing if it didn't think about the civilian population. And they penetrated the IDF defenses, and for 10 long hours, the IDF couldn't organize a real defense of Israeli soil. That rings loudly in the Middle East. And so Israel has to respond to that. You don't, when someone punches you, you don't punch the fist, right? You punch back at the face. You punch the head in response. I mean, try not to punch people, but you know what I'm saying. And so I think that there's been a kind of motionlessness in the Israeli leadership over the last 11 or 12 days. The army is standing on that border, not moving. This immense army, the entire economy is ground to a halt because of the largest call-up in the history of Israel, and then nothing. There's this Air Force, right, war, clearing the path, maybe some bunker busters in some places trying to get into the underground tunnels and bunkers, but there's almost nothing happening. I think that they threw out all of the plans that had been in, basically Israel's strategic plans for its environment. And I think there's a new plan. And the new plan is, first of all, to go crazy, to go wild, to exact a cost down the chain of command, down the chain of supply. And I think it goes to Iran. And I think the Americans heard that and were spooked, horrified, just terrified that the Israelis might take the region to a place in their shock and in their sense that they have to restore deterrence fast and they have to restore it brutal or it will, and engaged in the classic Joe Biden bear hug. Joe Biden has a strategy he has used before with Israel. If you think the Israelis are going to do something big and destabilizing, you do it with them. And then they're with you. They're talking to you, they're coordinating with you, they appreciate the help, and they don't do things that are beyond the pale of crazy, in your view. So I think that's what we just saw. All of the emotion is authentic, all of the support is authentic, and also, let's do this together so you guys don't accidentally spark the kind of war that we maybe have to get dragged into. Those aircraft carriers are not positioned to attack Iran. That would be the Persian Gulf. But in the Persian Gulf, they would also be very vulnerable to Iranian naval attack, and hard to defend, and it would really have to be an American aggressive, posture. But they are positioned perfectly for missile defense over Israel. They have some missile defense capabilities, those task forces, for refueling flights of Israeli craft that are maybe flying to Iran, for things like that. So I'm saying this because I have no knowledge, which is why I'm allowed to say these things. But none of it makes any sense to me. Not Blinken's meeting with the war cabinet, not Joe Biden suddenly having to visit on some desperately important solidarity visit. And I think that I don't think this ends in Gaza.
Okay. Very serious time and very serious words. And I want to thank you for being here, Haviv. My guess is you probably have not slept in the last 10 days between being there for others and your incredible writing and being there on Israeli and American press, translating what's happening there for everyone outside the country. I got so many messages in the Q&A expressing appreciation for you taking the time to speak with us, acknowledging the emotional toll it takes on you to share your insights and just expressing gratitude. I feel the same way, and thank you for being here. We look forward to the next time we can visit together, and I hope it'll be better times. Besorot tovot.
Thank you. Maybe we can go back to talking about judicial reform. Remember those days?
Seems a lot better now. Not the
Thank
reform.
you for having me.
The topic.
Yeah.
Take
Thanks
care.
a lot.